monthly column for Science Mind magazine. Has anyone seen his wonderful, his wonderful column? Every month is in that magazine. It's called The Art of Being Human. And he is also the chair of the Regeneration Committee that funds and mentors young individuals who want to go into ministry, those who are under 35. And he was the first graduate of that program. Yeah. So please welcome Masando Hiraoka.
Yay!
Thank you. Can we give it up for Karen Karsh again?
Yeah.
God, following Karen is like walking into a beautiful field of daisies. It's just like everything's gonna be all right. And it's I've never spoken here, but I think I have a feeling of the spirit of this place because I know Karen. And I know Leah, and Jyoti was just 1 year ahead of me in school. So I got to share like 2.5 years of going to ministerial school with her, and she is just an amazing gift and light. And I've always been so impressed with like how extremely creative and bright, yet like incredibly organized this human being is. She would always, like, every single presentation that she would give in class would just be like flawless. So I'd always like make sure to like go ahead of her to sign up because I was like, Jyoti's gonna crush it, and I can't follow that. So yeah, you guys are so lucky to have her here. I remember when her senior year, stuff happens your senior year, you know, because you're supposed to be like thinking about what you want to do with your ministry, and you go through all of these different iterations, but something happens when you start getting close to the end where you're like, oh God, this is getting really real. And I saw this happen for Jyoti. I don't think she ever even knew before that senior year that she was going to be like a leader of a community like this. And I began to see her step into this different aspect of her identity as someone who could lead a community, who was an amazing speaker, who had this capacity to bring people together in a way that I hadn't seen before. And so to see like the manifestation of that and to feel the energy that she's created in this room is like such an honor. So I don't know if she's watching, but Jyoti, thank you so much for inviting me and having me into your community. So that's really what, today's talk is all about. So the talk title for today is How Faith Evolves. And I just saw Bishop Carlton Pearson. Does anyone know Bishop Carlton Pearson? He has a movie on Netflix called Come Sunday. It's like a docudrama. There's a ton of stars in it too, like Martin Sheen is in it, and the guy that played the lead actor for 12 Years a Slave, and the dude who was like in How I Met Your Mother, like the tall guy. I don't know, you'll know him when you see him. He's in it. But it's this amazing movie that documents his life. He just came to Mile High just last week to give a talk about his faith path. So this guy, I'm really inspired by his story. He's from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he became this really huge pastor in the Pentecostal movement. So, and he was one of the first African American leaders to lead a church that had both a black and white community. And they ended up having like 6,000 people on a Sunday. So this dude was like kind of a big deal in the Pentecostal movement, was speaking all around the country, was, in his 40s and had become just sort of like this hotshot minister in the Pentecostal movement, right? And he was thriving and flourishing. He was at the peak of his career. And then sort of out of nowhere, something began to shift in him. And it kind of started when he had in the movie it shows that he had an uncle that was in jail, that was incarcerated, that never became a Christian, and in his mind, like, was never saved, right? So in that Pentecostal tradition, if you're not saved, it means that when you die, there's a belief that you go to hell, right? And so what sort of set off this thing is his uncle ended up committing suicide in jail. And he had to come to terms with the fact that, according to his church and his belief, that his uncle, this man who helped raise him, who brought him so much joy, was going to be living the rest of eternity suffering and being punished in hell, right? And then it shows, like, sort of after that, as he came into that awareness and understanding, this was right around the time when the civil war in Rwanda was going on. I don't know if you all remember that. And during this war, at this time, like 800,000 people had already died, half of which were children. And none of these folks were saved. Right? None of these had even heard the gospel. And according to his tradition, all of these 800,000 people were also going to be committed to living the rest of their lives in the afterlife, in hell, in eternity and suffering. Right? And he couldn't come to terms with that. And so he came to his church, 6,000 people, right? And who had been preaching this Pentecostal message to. And he said that, he was talking about what was going on in Rwanda, and he was talking about this conflict that he was having within himself. And he said to the audience, and I came to terms with, and I heard the voice of God say, they're already saved. And you could hear this like collective gasp in the audience, like, oh, in the movie, right? And people started walking out. Because it threatened this way of thinking, this theology of this belief in heaven and hell, right? And so he continued to preach this message, and just after even a few weeks or a few months, people began to leave the church. The entire white portion of the community left and started a church of their own just down the street.
Oh.
And he ended up going to essentially what was a trial with all of the other bishops and deacons within the Pentecostal movement, being asked to sort of defend his ideas, but eventually being sort of ridiculed in that room and thrown out, right? So it was not easy for him. It was not an easy road for him. He sacrificed a lot, and a lot of, his mentor and his friends who had helped him build this church were like, why are you doing this? You can come back, like you're forgiven. All you have to do is recant what you said. But he couldn't, right? Something in him had already shifted to create a more inclusive idea of what salvation is. But he had to give up a lot for that. Right? So it was no small thing. He lost his church. He lost his friends. He lost his mentor. And he ended up losing his ability to preach every Sunday for a few years of his life. But eventually, he came to a deeper belief and a deeper understanding and a deeper walk with the divine through this experience, right? And his faith began to evolve in a way where more people were able to experience the love of God. His biggest thing was there is no way that anyone can be separate from the love of the divine. And so he ended up, building another church and getting together with the Universalist Unitarians and building a community there, and he still to this day has a beautiful multicultural church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's a beautiful thing to watch because I think we all have our sort of version of this story. I love what Centers for Spiritual Living, the kind of people that a space like this attracts, right? Because I'm going to guess that each one of you has your own sort of evolution of faith path story. That maybe you were brought up in some sort of religious tradition that gave you a lot, but maybe there's a piece where you're like, well, there's got to be something else, right? And so you don't have to leave all of that behind, but you can then begin to just create a bigger awareness and maybe a more full experience of the divine than you were able to before. What I love is that this place attracts spiritual seekers like yourself who are continually sort of taking part in this mystical tradition of a direct experience of the divine, right? So I love spaces like this, and I love meeting people that are attracted to this, because it's like, oh, these are my people, you know? And Ernest Holmes, that dude back there, sitting in the robe at the back of the room, this is who he was too, you know? Like he was brought up in the Christian tradition, but he really was able to be exposed to all of these other ideas, especially like Eastern thought. And he really he was really impacted by the idea in Hinduism of oneness, and he was, exposed to Thomas Troward and these ideas that we don't have to wonder if God is answering our prayers. Like God answers every prayer. And our job is to realize that God is always answering our prayer. It's our inability to receive that dictates whether or not that prayer happens, right? So it's the depth of our own belief that actually dictates our ability to make great changes in our life, right? So he puts it back on us and say, God is always listening. God is always there. God actually resides within and around us. But how open are we to actually receiving the things that we are seeking to bring into more fully in our life, right? But even he evolved throughout his life, right? And he talks about, his last book he wrote is called The Voice Celestial. And it's really different than all of his other books. It's like an epic poem that rhymes that he wrote with his brother Fenwick. And there's the introduction given by Christian Sorensen, who's this pastor, this minister in San Diego. He's a surfer. He's been preaching for 30 years, and he shows up in flip-flops and a Hawaiian shirt every Sunday. It's amazing. But he gave the introduction to this book, and I just want to share with you what he says about Ernest Holmes and his evolution at the end of his life. He says that, and he was talking to this other reverend who worked directly with Ernest. He said, I enjoyed lunch recently at a restaurant on the California coast overlooking the blue Pacific with Reverend James Pottinger. This brilliant religious science minister lived with Ernest Holmes at his home in Los Angeles for over 2 years during the time Ernest and his brother Fenwick were writing The Voice Celestial. Reverend Pottinger reported how Ernest would use him as a sounding board as he shared some of the beautiful phrases from the book. He was also a member of Dr. Holmes' Tuesday morning class, by invitation only, at the institute, where he would read this evolving epic poem to his selected students for feedback. Reverend Pottinger reported how Ernest was concerned that The Voice Celestial would make his textbook, The Science of Mind, obsolete, because it reveals to the reader that we evolve from the cause and effect of science of mind to the acceptance of pre-existing wholeness. Right? We all have a pre-existing condition. And that's our birthright as totally whole. And I remember being so relieved when I read this, because, and it was the introduction to a book, and I was tearing up, because I was so impacted by this, because my life has mirrored that a little bit. I grew up in this tradition. And this tradition, when you first come to it, it's oh wow, change your thinking, change your life. You're I have all of this power. Oh my God, Peter Pan is real. All I have to do is think a happy thought, and I can fly, I can fly, I can fly. And I can just soar above all the suffering in the world, and I can look down upon, look at all those weak-minded souls. Don't they know that all I have to do is think positively? And that's all well and good, right? Until something happens, like in the hero's journey that you're talking about, that brings you back down to earth, right? Grandson moves in with you, 16 years old. You lose a job, or you have a change in your career. Maybe you go through a divorce. Maybe you have a health challenge, right? And something shifts. Or we're called to find an aspect of our lives that is not just seeking to only experience the highs and happy thoughts and only think that God is present there. But also come into a deeper understanding of this thing called life and know that even in the times where we're going through our hero's journey, that just like Karen's song said, like, God is here too. Like right here in the midst of whatever it is, or whatever stuff we may be experiencing, that presence of the divine is never absent, right? And often, like, our faith becomes even deeper when we have an experience of it in those times, right? It's easy to believe in this stuff when, like, life is going really well.
Yeah.
But we say we know, right? Like, there's this idea of knowing that's deeper than belief, right? It's deeper than that. It's like we know this, and that's how we pray. It's like, I know. I found that I wasn't able to say those words like I know and really believe it in my mind until I had an experience of faith during a time that was rough. During a time when I couldn't see the light, right? So I'm doing a series. Does anyone know who Barbara Brown Taylor is? She wrote another book called An Altar in the World, which talks about the ordinary aspects of spirituality. So she's really cool. She was also a pastor that went through her own crisis of faith and came to a deeper understanding. And she wrote this book called Learning to Walk in the Dark. She was on Oprah, so you know she's made it. All you got to do as an author is make it on Oprah and you're set for life. So this is what she talks about when she talks about this idea of darkness, right? She says, if you decide to read the rest of the book, you will learn plenty about what darkness means to me. For now, it is enough to say that darkness is shorthand for anything that scares me, that I want no part of, either because I am sure that I do not have the resources to survive it, or because I do not want to find out.
Yeah.
The absence of God is in there, along with the fear of dementia and the loss of those nearest and dearest to me. So is the melting of the polar ice caps, the suffering of children, and the nagging question of what it will feel like to die. If I had my way, I would eliminate everything from chronic back pain to the fear of the devil from my life and the lives of those I love, if I could just find the right night lights to leave on. At least I think I would. The problem is this: when, despite all my best efforts, the lights have gone off in my life, literally or figuratively, take your pick, plunging me into the kind of darkness that turns my knees to water, nonetheless, I have not died. The monsters have not dragged me out of bed and taken me back to their lair. The witches have not turned me into a bat. Instead, I have learned things in the dark that I could have never learned in the light, things that saved my life over and over again. So there is really only one logical conclusion. I need darkness as much as I need light. That to me is such a freeing concept, right? Because I think being raised in this tradition was amazing. Like, people always come up to me like, oh, if I only knew this when I was young like you, like, my life would have been so different. Like, I would have been a billionaire by now. And I was like, yeah, it's been pretty cool, I guess, but it's also been a lot of pressure. You know, I have to think like good thoughts all the time. There's a lot of pressure. Who can do that? Like, nobody can do that. It's impossible, right? Which is why I really got into Buddhist meditation, where I learned that my thoughts weren't so powerful after all. They were just my ridiculous monkey mind jumping from tree to tree. You know, I think the first teacher that I learned from is saying, I liken the mind to a drunk and wild elephant being driven by a drunk and wild monkey. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, that's my experience.
Which one are you?
Right, all of it. And that's the feeling of that, though, and what I got from recognizing that my thoughts weren't as powerful as I had made them out to be, is that in every aspect of my human experience, there is brilliance, right? And there's the capacity to bring me into a deeper relationship with the divine. And something that brings me closer to, not further away from, but actually closer to myself and my own soul and why I'm here. I actually love the fall and the winter. I love the summer because we can go and do stuff and we hike and it's lots of playtime and, long days, flip-flops. That's my jam. But I can't tell you how much, when I get to this time when, I am so ready to stop. I am so ready to slow down. I am so ready to put on a beanie and a puffy coat and just walk around in the silence right after a snow and just be with the dark days and the silent nights of winter so I can hear my own soul speak to me for a little bit. And that's what darkness brings, right? Darkness brings the brilliance of the stars. Darkness brings some good, cozy time with the self. Darkness brings this ability to find a strength and find a resilience that can only come when we're challenged just a little bit, or when it's not so easy to find. And so, what I know for all of us is that we're all a part of this journey, right? And Barbara Brown Taylor talks about a lunar spirituality, and how our spirituality and our experience of the divine waxes and wanes like the moon. Some days it's so easy, sometimes it's just brilliant, and some days it's I have no idea, I feel so far away. But in the midst of it feeling so far away, just like Karen talked about, there's that whisper. And that whisper reveals a deeper knowing and a deeper relationship and a deeper faith we could have ever experienced. And a deeper strength than we ever could have found within ourselves, which is always there, right? Than had we been just living in unicorn and fairyland and Turkish delight all the time. So I know for each one of us is our path, wherever we're at on the hero's journey. That's exactly where you need to be. And so embrace it a little bit and realize that you don't have to change anything. You don't got to hide. You don't have to cheer up. You don't have to think a happy thought. If someone tells me to think a happy thought when I'm in the midst of a sad moment, I got your happy thought right here. You're good, exactly as you are, exactly where you are. The divine is right there with you, and it will reveal to you everything that you need, and it will give to you every inner resource that is required for you to walk through this moment with clarity, with joy, and with strength. So let's ground all this in some prayer, some contemplation of our own lives. We just bring into our awareness this fullness, this wholeness, this pre-existing condition that we've all been born with. And that is coming to this planet absolutely whole, absolutely complete. Given to us all that we need for any time in our life, both the joyful times and the times that may be filled with challenge. That our birthright is to feel the wholeness of life itself and to understand and remember and recognize that we are a part of that wholeness. And it's through that wholeness that we come into a deeper communion with humanity itself. And as we are brought down to earth, that our roots actually extend out and connect with each and every other living being on this planet, so that compassion fills us, so that we not only want to create a world that works for us, but a world that works for all, because we are so connected that there is no salvation of one without the salvation of all. There is no enlightenment with one without the enlightenment of all. So we allow that to be. And we allow ourselves to be. We allow ourselves to be exactly where we're at, knowing that this is exactly what we need. We have all of the support that is required to find the goal that is right here in the midst. And so we give thanks, right? We give actual gratitude for every aspect of our life. For all the ways that has given us life, all the ways that we have given back to it, all of the ways that we've experienced joy, and all the ways that we've been asked to find a deeper strength and resilience. How good is it to be alive, to be human, and to know that we are so deeply connected that we could maybe never even fathom how deep that connection goes, but we are coming more into awareness of that every single day. So we give thanks for that. We allow our lives to be the manifestation, to be the blessing in the world. To know that every aspect has already been blessed, that every prayer has already been answered. And so we release it all so that our lives become full like the moon, and that every person becomes a reflection of that divine light. We can truly call it good, like good beyond good and bad, just good, because it truly is. And so it is.